Welcome back, everybody. If you are joining us through the internet, welcome back. If you haven't watched our first one, it was the problem of science. Can science and Christianity exist in the same world, or are they mortal enemies against each other? And what we discovered and talked about is that they're not enemies. In fact, Christian theology is the garden out of which science grew. And this week, we're going to be talking about the existence of God. Does God exist? And I've got my class here, so y'all get my fullest attention from here on out. Glad y'all are able to come. Like I said, continuing the problem of God. And the reason we're doing this is because the world is going to question our faith. It's going to ask us, why do you believe what you believe? And if we go with what Peter says, we need to have an answer for the hope that we put our faith in. And so through this series, we're going to be answering some of the big questions that the world asks us as Christians that many of us just put to the side and not sure what we believe. So to start off with the existence of God, we have to tackle a pretty big subject right off. You see, there are few things, if any, that you can prove with 100% level of certainty. And for whatever reason, the implications, maybe it's because the implications of God's existence are so profound, we tend to demand a greater level of certainty for God's existence than we do for anything else. But the reality is that we cannot be 100% certain about anything. So let me give you an example, and this is probably going to date me, but who here has seen the Matrix movies? Nobody in here has seen the Matrix movie. You don't need to know what it's about. I'll give you a basic rundown. In the Matrix storyline, reality for human beings is just an elaborate computer simulation. So you're living in a reality, aliens are coming to take over human species, and so to distract them so that they can take them over, they hook their brains to cables, they put them in these little bubble pods, and our reality, to distract them, is not real, but we think it's real. And the only way to break out of this false reality is by taking a red pill, right? So my question is, can you prove with 100% certainty that we are not living in a computer simulation right now? Anybody? Can you prove that? No. You can't. In fact, and it may be absurd for me to ask you, like to imagine that you are living in a computer simulation. It might sound absurd, but there's actually an Oxford professor who's studying this very thing. Like, this is not obscure for us to truly think about. In fact, this is something that maybe not computer simulation, but people and philosophers have been thinking about for centuries. There's a famous philosopher, very dead now. His name is René Descartes, and he has this famous saying where he claims, "I think, therefore I am." And so what he's basically saying in that statement is, I cannot prove anything. He's like, I can't even prove that this chair exists. Because if you are out of your mind, so think of a crazy person, everything that a crazy person believes is absolutely true for them, right? But they could be making up all kinds of realities that aren't actually true. So this chair may be true for me, but I don't know if it's true for anybody else. The only thing that I can prove with an absolute certainty is that I am thinking right now. And if I'm thinking right now, I exist in some kind of form. But the problem is, if you were with us last week, we talked about the evolutionary theory, about how you cannot trust your cognitive functions, right? Because your cognitive functions, according to the evolutionary theory, they're just trying to move your genes to the next pool, and so they'll make up all kinds of things. It'll make up morality and meaning and a God consciousness and science. It'll make up all of this stuff just for you to survive. So we can't even trust our own thoughts. So all of this to say, you cannot prove that anything exists. You cannot prove anything certainty. But for whatever reason, we demand, for God's existence, we demand absolute 100% certainty in order for us to believe, even though we don't for anything else. So what I'm not saying, and what I don't want you to hear, is that we cannot absolutely have confidence in our belief in God, but rather, it's not that we can't have confidence in what we believe. It's that we cannot prove that that belief is actually true. Does that make sense? So I can have confidence in something, but not fully have all of the evidence to make it true. All I have to do and all we have to do with our beliefs is tip a scale, right? We cannot prove with 100% certainty about anything, but we can weigh the evidence in order to lean one direction or the other. So I can put all my chips that God isn't real or all my chips that God is real. I'm going to weigh the evidence, and whichever one outweighs the other, I'm going to lean into that truth to be true. And that's what we're talking about here. We're weighing the evidence. We as Christians, we're not checking our brain at the door. We're actually doing extensive study to study, is this thing true? There's a common phrase, maybe you've heard it, blind faith. You've heard of that phrase, blind faith? So that is a modern phrase, a modern construct. Blind faith, that phrase, is not rooted in any kind of Christian tradition. Christians throughout antiquity, throughout history, they have always had confidence and evidence to back up what they believe. They don't live in this like fantasy state of like, well, I can't prove anything and I don't want to dig into it, but I just believe whatever I feel like. We don't believe that way, and we shouldn't believe that way because that doesn't hold any ground in our life or in the community. And whenever you weigh the evidence, you have things happen like what happened to this dude. Antony Flow, he is a notorious atheist, and he wrote a book. At the end of his life, There Is a God, crossing out no, how the world's most notorious atheist changed his mind. And what he says in this book, it's a great book, if you want to borrow it. It's a little high language and high reading, but it's really interesting. He has this quote, he says, "I now believe there is a God. I now think the evidence does point to a creative intelligence." And all Antony Flow did was look at the evidence. He didn't say, no, I just believe blindly. I don't need to go investigate. I'm just going to believe in what my ancestors say or what my family says or what my tradition says. No, he went and dug for the evidence, and it pointed to God, didn't point away. So the evidence for God's existence can be seen in, we'll get to that quote here in a second, can be seen in about 24 different disciplines. We're just going to focus on two primary ones, okay? Mainly for time, but also because two famous philosophers, maybe you know them, maybe you don't, talked about the two disciplines we're going to talk about. So Immanuel Kant, the evidence of God can be proven by the moral law within and the starry hosts above. Or maybe a more familiar person, Plato, he once said, there are two things that lead men to believe in God: the argument from the existence of the soul and the argument for the order of the motions of the stars. So the two disciplines we're going to look at tonight, anthropology and cosmology. So anthropology, why do I function in my social constructs, in my social circles? Why do I function and make the moral decisions that I do? And why do we as humans? And then looking at the universe and the quilted stars that are over us every night, we're going to look up, we're going to look in, and do those two disciplines. We're going to try to point towards the existence of God. So let's start with morality. So morality, in its basic definition, it's what you or your society or what your culture determines what is right. So C.S. Lewis, in this amazing book called Mere Christianity, which I highly recommend everybody to read. This is an extensive quote, but it's going to make sense as we read through it, so don't worry about that. But C.S. Lewis says, everybody has heard people quarreling. Like we've all heard people fighting, right? They say things like this: how would you like it if anybody did the same to you? Or, that's my seat, I was here first. Or, leave him alone, he isn't doing you any harm. People say things like this every day. Educated people as well as uneducated people, children as well as grown-ups. Now, what interests me about all of these remarks is that the man making them is not merely saying that the other man's behavior does not please him. No, but what is he saying? He seems to be appealing to some kind of standard behavior, which he expects the other man to know about. It looks, in fact, very much as if both parties had in mind some kind of law or rule of fair play or decent behavior or morality or whatever you want to call it, about which they really agreed. We don't need C.S. Lewis, we don't need that quote to know what he's talking about, though. I'll give you a personal example. Whenever I was studying for this lesson last week, I was sitting in our driveway, eating some apples, drinking some sweet tea, watching the boys play this basketball game they made up, right? And they're shooting the basketball. My oldest one's shooting it. The younger one's shooting it. They each have their own ball. And the game is basically they make a basket, they keep score, and they're just trying to stay with each other the whole time. So the older one's stronger and taller, and he gets ahead, right? He gets like 2 baskets ahead. And out of nowhere, the little one yells, "That's not fair. That's not fair." Now, where did he get the idea of fairness? Like we've never sat down with him and talked about, here's what fairness is. Here's what morality looks like. Here you got to be fair with each other. There seems to be something embedded and niched inside every person from the youngest age that desires fairness. There's some kind of law or rule or morality knitted inside of us. And you could say, well, maybe they picked it up in various things, the TV shows they watch and like watching their parents and how they interact and conversations they have at school, right? And that's what moral relativism says. It says morality is picked up within cultures and your experiences. That decides what is right. But let me challenge that. Okay, Darian, you grew up watching different TV shows and having different experience with parents than, we'll say, Paul did. You'll have very different experiences. I mean, they're similar in some ways, but they're also very different. Different parts of the country you grew up in. And yet, you could come in blindly and agree on many things. And you say, well, we're both Christians, we both have the same standards, we were raised in the same country. Okay, go to the other side of the world. And you're going to go find anybody in our community, and you're going to find things like murder and cheating and stealing. Like these are things that seem to be embedded, even though we disagree on all of the details. There seems to be something from the youngest age, right? Aubrey's going to begin developing this, right? She's going to begin saying like, what's fair, what's not fair, what's true, what's not true. And you're going to have to explain it to her, like what is fairness, what's true. Because there's something inside of her, just like it was all of us, that tells us there's fairness or not fairness. Now let me show you where moral relativism is contradictory. So moral relativism says it's a belief that we like to chant, but we don't fully believe. It's a chant of like, you do you, I'll do me, you live over there, I'll live over here, and as long as we're at peace with each other and we can make that happen, the world is going to go round. That's moral relativism, right? You get to choose what's morally right for you, what's relative for you, and I'll choose it for me. But let me show you in history where that runs into a problem. In the 60s and 70s, there was a generation of a sexual revolution, right? We call this the hippie era. And it was a popular lifestyle and mindset of free spirit living. And we look at that and we're like, yeah, okay, free spirit, living with no bounds, doing what you want. And moral relativism, it was the motto of the day, right? It's like nobody's going to tell me what I can do with my body, right? I'll do whatever I want. Moral relativism to the person, morality is relative to the person who concludes it. Like stop trying to inhibit me with your old-fashioned views of sex and drugs and my lifestyle. But here's the problem. In the very next breath, those same people were protesting the Vietnam War, which they saw to be morally unjust. And they imposed their views on everybody else who disagreed with them. And that fad hasn't gone away. If you're going to hear anything, hear this about moral relativism. Moral relativism is a cop-out for imposing my views on another person while safeguarding my views from criticism of others. It's saying, I can do whatever I want as long as everybody believes in what I believe in, we're cool. But the second you don't believe in what I believe, all of a sudden, that motto goes out the window. Like if you're going to believe in moral relativism, you got to be conclusive in it. You have to be absolute in it. You have to, you can't come at me for sleeping with my sister. You can't come at me for stealing from my grandma or deciding to murder somebody who cuts me off in line. Because if I get to choose what's right for me, those things might be right. So you're either conclusive in moral relativism, or you choose that, no, there is some morality embedded in all human beings, in our nature, that points to something outside of us. The Bible has been saying this forever. Romans chapter 2, verse 14 through 15, it says, Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. We'll make sense of that right now. They show that the requirements of the law are what? Written on their hearts. Their conscience are also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them and at other times are defending them. What Paul's saying here is that Gentiles are not God's people. They're not the Jews. They weren't given the 10 Commandments. They weren't given the 613 other commands. But yet, they seem, even though they don't have the law given to those people, they seem to still be living within the same standards that the law was trying to get the Jews to live by. As if the law was where? Written on their hearts. As if there is something inside of them that points them to what is good and true for all people. And if this goes against everything that the evolutionary theory points against. So the idea of laying down your life for a person, as the Bible often defines love to be, is completely counter to the survival of the fittest, you do you mentality, right? That's why we will jump into a freezing lake to save somebody, or if we don't do that, we at least feel guilty for it. Because there's something inside of me, just like there's something inside all of us that is beyond us, that goes against survival of the fittest, and goes against you choosing just what's right for you and me. So that's one discipline, but now we get to have fun. We talked about us for enough. Now let's talk about the stars. So if we're going to understand anything about the study of the stars, we have to learn what the word contingency means. It's a pretty simple phrase. It's the idea that if something begins to exist, its existence is dependent on something outside of it that pre-existed it, causing it to come into being. So if something exists, it has to have something outside that pre-existed it that caused it to come into existence. So I'll give you a very easy example. For you to sit here, a lot of things, like there had to been, you sitting over here right now is contingent on many things. Let me put it that way. One of the most important things is that your parents had to meet. They had to fall in love. They had to light some candles, and, well, you know the rest, right? But that was contingent on you being here, along with a bunch of other things. Something outside of you had to happen in order for you to come into existence. David Hume, he was an 18th century skeptic. He said, "I never asserted such an absurd proposition that anything might arise without a cause." If something exists, it has to have come into existence by something outside of itself, right? So this was speculative for the longest time. People doubted this for the longest time, at least until Edwin Hubble came along and gave us this image. So through a breakthrough telescope, Hubble discovered that galaxies were rapidly moving away from each other. And the way you can tell that is you have some that are blue and some that are red. Red, they're moving away from the point of view. Blue, they're moving closer. I might have that switch, but you get the idea. Moving closer to the point of view. So they calculated all of it and what the direction everything's going, people much smarter than me, and they concluded, well, everything had to have been in one place at one time. Now, the Big Bang Theory is accepted in all major fields of science, but people were speculative. The science community was speculative of this. And they were speculative of this because of something like this guy would say. He's from Auburn, J.M. Wersinger. It says, the Big Bang Theory, it seems to give in to the Judeo-Christian idea of a beginning of the world. It also seemed to have to call for an act of supernatural creation. You see, Christianity has been saying the Big Bang from the very beginning. We just, for whatever reason, we switch places with science, and now we're scared of it. But the idea that everything came into existence at one time, and if you believe in contingency, that means if something came into existence, something had to pre-exist to bring that thing into existence. We have an answer for what that thing is. Science doesn't yet, but they are just now settling in on the idea that everything, that the universe had an existence. Here's just a free one to blow your mind. What they discovered through later research, but mainly with the start of the Hubble telescope, is that it's not just the universe that's expanding, it's space itself. So what I don't mean by space is like outer space. What I mean by space is the place where matter can exist, like space. So what is beyond space? Well, literally nothing. Like nothing, no matter can exist where there is no space. So as the universe is expanding, what they discovered is that space itself is being created where matter can exist. There was nothing, there was something in just a moment. But let's move off of the beginning to a more practical evidence with astronomy. A famous philosopher named William Paley, he lived in the 18th century. He once pointed out, he's like, say you're walking on a beach. So we have beaches here. We can imagine that. He says, say you're walking on a beach and you come across a chipped piece of a tree. You can pretty much conclude, okay, that might have chipped off on an island some out in the water and it floated through the ocean. Where has this thing been? And it's ended up here on our beach. How awesome. But then he said, now imagine you're walking on that same beach and you come across a watch. Now, what you cannot deduce from that is that all of the gears and leather and parts floated in the ocean, and over time they came together and fell into place into how we function a watch, how all the functions that a watch takes, and it landed on our beach. He says that's whatever. What you have to conclude, Paley's point, what you have to conclude is that there is an intelligent mind behind that watch, which we talked about last week. There's intelligence. Somebody created and designed that thing. And Paley claims that the same logic has to be carried over when you observe the universe. You have to have the same conclusion. This is called the anthropic principle, and it's the most powerful argument for God's existence. The anthropic principle. And it's the argument that the universe is so finely tuned that the mathematical chances of it are so minuscule, they're laughable. So scholars tell us that the chances of the universe coming into existence were 10 to the 138th. That seems like a big number, I guess. It's hard to really tell what that number means, so let me give you some context. 10 to the 17th is our best estimate of the number of seconds in the entire history of the universe. The very old theory, not the new Earth theory. Let me give you another example, or another context. 10 to the 70th is the number of atoms in the entire universe. Which is hard to imagine, but... Well, what I'm getting to is that the chance of our universe coming to existence is a far grander number. Like the chances are so obscure for us to even imagine, but yet the universe and all of its complexities still came into existence. So to imagine that this could happen by random chance is absurd. It's like a watch and all of the parts swimming in the ocean coming together and making a watch. It's an absurd argument because of the chances that we're seeing. Astronomer Fred Hoyle concludes, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics, as well as chemistry and biology, and there is no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. Or as the infamous Stephen Hawking said, if the rate of expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million millionth, I guess that's a number, but if a tiny fraction of the Big Bang had been smaller, the universe would have collapsed before it ever reached its present size. The point, the odds of our universe, not just talking about our Earth and us living here, which is its own outrageous number, but just the odds of our universe coming into existence are a laughable mathematical equation. How can you not look at that and point to somebody has monkeyed with this? Somebody, some kind of intellect, beautiful mind has put this into place because the odds are too high. And yes, you can argue, well, maybe we just got lucky, right? So if you're playing a deal of cards and you get dealt a royal flush on the very first hand, you're like, yeah, the odds of that are very low, but sometimes you get lucky and sometimes it happens, and maybe we just got lucky. But the problem with those kind of arguments is that the chances are just they're not comparable. What it rather would be like is that you play a hand of cards and you get dealt a royal flush and you win and you get the money, and then they shuffle the cards and they deal again and you get another royal flush, and then you win and you get the money, and then you shuffle again. And in fact, it would be as if for the rest of the hands that you play your entire life, you were dealt a royal flush. That's what the odds we're talking about here. And the first time, people would think you got lucky. The second time, people would think, well, something's up. And by the third time, you're cheating, right? You're monkeying with this. You're doing something. You're manipulating it to make it happen. And that's what astronomers, that's what scientists, when you look up at the stars and you look at our universe that we exist and you look at the mathematical chances, the only conclusion you can come to is somebody was behind this making it happen, because the odds are so laughable. Do we live in a multiverse? Probably not. And there's reasons that I'm not going to get into here. But as a conclusion, maybe we're dealing with a beautiful mind here. And maybe the reason so many can look at all of this evidence, look at the stack of evidence. And remember, we just looked at 2 of like 24 different disciplines that you can look at. We just looked at anthropology and cosmology, and we looked at them briefly. You can look at all of the different sciences and ologies, and that they will all point to some kind of higher being. Maybe people look at the stack of evidence and they ignore it because it leads them to something they have already pre-established doesn't exist. When we talked about that last week, we all have faith in something. And the problem is whenever we allow our belief to influence our science and our observation of the world. Some people go in with the idea that the world or that God does not exist, and so my science is going to be influenced by that belief. And some people go into it believing no God exists and I can't be convinced out of it, and they allow that to skew the way they observe the world. So what we want to do is to put our belief to the side and just look at the evidence and see which way the scale tips. And as Christians, we cannot be afraid of following the evidence. I would dare say it is rational to believe that a God does exist, that there's evidence that points to it. And we shouldn't be afraid of science and digging into that deeper in our belief in God.